G'day, Dave Pettit here with Season 2 of the Harvestaire Podcast Series. I'd like to welcome back our harvester contractor and extraordinaire, Mr. Rod Gribble. G'day, Rod.
How you going, Dave?
Very well, mate, very well. So now, in our first interview, we chatted about your experience and with different harvesters and improvements that you've made to help farmers and contractors in different variable conditions and things like that. I thought today might be an opportunity to discuss some basic but vital setup and calibration points, Rod.
Yep, these are the basic and vital points, and most of them are all in the operator's manuals, which, don't know, but people just don't want to read them for whatever reason. But it is just the basics of the machine to get right. Like, there's often people will ring me up and say, you know, I've heard you make concaves, I heard you do this, and I need some. And maybe they do, but I will try and run them through just the basics because, quite frankly, the engineers and the design people of these machines, doesn't matter what colour they are, you know, they've spent hundreds of thousands of hours of development, whether it's field development, assessment, and theoretical development as well, and assessment, getting these things right before they hit the market. And I reckon they've got a pretty good idea of what they're doing. And most of what they've been done and advice is in those operators' manuals. And so it's basically just getting out those operating manuals and just read them from front to back. And so you've got, you know, from a front to back experience and knowledge of what happens, because the crop comes in the front and goes out the back. It might sound all, you know, logical and things, but that's what it is. It's just a logical approach to getting the machine set right for a start.
So along with that, like saying about, you know, you're reading the manual and things like that, obviously it's for a lot of blokes out there, it's a big no-no right from the start. You don't need to worry about reading the manual. You just jump in and away you go. But, you know, it seems, especially nowadays with a lot of technology coming in and things like that and different alarm bells and beeps and all sorts of the trickery that goes on with them, would be a good idea to know exactly what all these beeps and alarms are for.
Exactly. Every new machine that comes out, a new model, there's always some changes in them. And the engineers, they do a few little bits and pieces, and it makes them a bit better all the time. And then the technology that runs over the top, like the automation, that makes them better still. So all that information is in the operator's manuals, or the likes of Case, John Deere, New Holland, Classel, etc. They've got updated YouTube videos and things like that, just basically, you know, run from front to back. And that's what they really need to get right for a start. Because, you know, most of the machines they're just assembled in the factory, and often it's in a rush at the dealership, and sometimes things get missed. And so, in my opinion, an owner-operator should really go through them from, you know, front to back, just to make sure that they're dead right all the time.
So, Rod, can we go through the basics and obviously starting right at the beginning?
Yeah, so if we're starting at the front, and, you know, which is, you know, the draper front, what most people refer to these days and use, and it doesn't really matter whether they're a MacDon or a John Deere or something like that. They're basically all the same. Those knife sections and guards must be in top conditions for them to at least cut properly, because if you don't, that draws a lot of extra horsepower down that drive line, and then you'll have sort of bunching, feeding and things like that, and that goes all the way through the machine. So, you know, the basic sort of things on those fronts is make sure those knife sections and guards are in top condition, and if you're in doubt, just replace them. Now, there's MacDons and things like that, they've got a balance on their weight from left to right and things like that, and we're just talking about a fixed front, not a flex one at this stage, but the same sort of thing for a flex, is you've got to get that balance right and that weight right, and all that stuff is all in the operator's manuals, or, well, like I said, there's heaps and heaps of MacDon videos about how to do it. Particularly in a MacDon, the feeder drum, just make sure that drive chain is tensioned correctly, and you take those covers off the drum and get all the chaff and seeds and, you know, all that stuff that builds up in there, because there's a clutch in there There's also a whole heap of retractable fingers and guides and things like going round. So if you keep all that clean in there, that helps the whole situation a lot. If it all builds up and like it'll rain on it one day and get wet in there, and well, that can cause a whole heap of grief. The rollers, the bearings in the rollers, they need to be checked at least once a year. And if you know you've got a particular model of draper front that, this bearing on that side or in the centre, they can fail, often just replace it at the start of the year. Say you got a new one, so you just know that you'll be right. You won't have that trouble. So, that's the basics on any draper front is, get them right for a start, because all your machine efficiency starts right at the cutter bar. And so you just got to start at the front and move your way back. Once you've done the draper fronts, well, then you need to check the feeder house as the next bit. So make sure all the feeder chain, the bars are good. Nothing is bent or broken or anything else. There's bearings on those front rollers there. If you've got a particular machine that, chops them out every, 500 hours or 200 hours or whatever, just change them. It's not a difficult job, but it's in the shed, so to speak, before season, but it's not a fun job when you're trying to do it when it's 45 degrees out the paddock. Yep, and so all those bits, and that's, getting those basic bits right.
Absolutely. So once you've then had a look at and checked out the feeder house, where do we move on to next, Rod?
Most machines now are running a rotary machine, so there's some sort of transition cone from the feeder house to the rotor. Now, case run, they call it a transition cone. John Deere call it something else, but it's basically the same thing. New Holland, well, obviously they're twin rotors, but it's basically the same thing. It's some sort of, you're converting a horizontal flow into a centrifugal flow, like a circular flow. And so John Deere has a feed accelerator there, and New Holland have what do they call that, DFR, dynamic feed roller, which basically helps feed those rotors. And so all those bits and pieces along there need to be checked for wear, and if they're worn out of spec, well, they just need replacing. Like I said before, you're much better off to do it before harvest than in the middle of it.
Most definitely, yes. So then once we've had a look at the transition cone and the rotors, where do we move on to from there?
Well, then you move into the rotors of, a particular machine. And so for a case, there's an AFX rotor, and then there's a small tube rotor. It's called an ST40. I'd say most of your listeners would be running an AFX rotor. And so they need to fit all what's called grain bars over the concave area, and then spiked bars in the separation area. The spike bars, there's a little spike on about 25 mil long, and what that does is thins out the material layer and aids the separation to get more and more grain out. In an ST rotors, there's a couple of things. There's a combination of 10-degree bars and 28-degree bars you can run. You run the 10-degree bars over the concave area and the 28-degree spiked ones over the separation area. And what that basically does, to pinch a New Holland phrase, it basically makes that rotor gives it a twin pitch effect. And so the 10-degree bars will slow that down, material down, and the 28-degree will speed it up. And so the change of speed will aid separation. Now, there's rotor cage covers for a case probably on the right-hand side, because the cage has got a lot of slots in it, and those slots are made for corn and soybeans and things like that. Unless you're doing corn, especially on the right-hand side over the number 2 concave, that should be covered up. You can leave, everything else is fine, you can leave them open. Then the concaves. Now, it's best to read that book about what's called level and centre in a case for those concaves. And what that does is obviously levels the concave to the rotor tube, so it's got at least level, and then it centres. So on an AFX rotor, that is 81 mil from front to back in level, and on the left-hand side, that's 81 mil from front to back on the left-hand side. It's all explained in the operator's manual, but there's some great case training videos online, and they will show you how it's done. Because it might sound a bit complicated to read it, but once you've seen how it's done, like, it's pretty easy to do, but it makes a lot of difference to get that right. Because otherwise you can have the concave, hanging down at the back or something, and it's not even, so it won't thrash, or it's not parallel, which means the centre, and you might have one side that's 4 or 5 mil, or, it could be 10 mil out from one side to the other, and it's just, you can't get that efficiency out of that machine. So those are the very, very basic things to do for that concave and rotor setup. And then once you do all that with all the OEM concaves, at least you've got a really good starting point to say, well, yep, I've done the best I can for that. And if you think that it's not thrashing properly or it's not separating properly, well, then you look for some aftermarket stuff to see if that makes it any better. And there's plenty of, aftermarket things on the market for people to have a look at, but they've just got to find out and work out, well, what do they really need for it? Now, there's a couple of other bits in a case. There's an area behind the rotor and in front of the chopper beater. There's an open section there, and it's a great area, and that's again for corn. So unless you're doing corn, you can just buy that plate from case dealership and cover that up, because in our conditions, mostly our conditions are very hot and dry and brittle, and a lot of material would just go straight through that grate and overload the cleaning system. So you're better off to cover that up. And I do a lot of rice and everything, and I just have it covered up all the time. There's plenty of separation for them. And the same thing goes for New Holland and John Deere, to try and get those concaves absolutely level. And you can't do much with a John Deere to get it moved over left or right, because that's just fixed where they are. And most of them are pretty right, but just level is very important. New Holland, you can move those a little bit left and right, but there's a measurement in the operator's manual. And again, the engineers have worked out where the best position is for that concave to be. So I'd suggest people take heed of what the engineers say in the operator's manuals and set it up to that. They've tested them all around the world, and their recommendation is a very, very good starting point, I think.
Absolutely. So how about the separation modules with the concaves?
There's a couple of variations in separation modules and that. There's OEM ones, which, all make their own, and they work reasonably well in most conditions, in most crops around the world, because that's what the engineers do. Sure, they can make probably some better ones for specific crops and specific conditions, but you've got to know what you want. Now, in saying that, as you probably know, I've been playing around with these things for a while, and so I made better separation modules for case. This has probably had about 3 versions of them, and the version we have now seems to be working extremely well in every crop, and there's been 60 or 70 sets running around all over Australia and even one overseas, and it makes a lot of difference to them in that separation and reducing that rotor loss. We've done a couple, 5 sets for John Deere S series as well, and that's made them a lot better. Because John Deere S series, rotor loss is their problem in those high straw load conditions. And the New Hollands with CRs have done a bit with those, and it really helps them as well. New Hollands are a pretty good machine straight out of the box. They're probably more designed for grain than the red and the green. They're probably more designed for corn, soybeans, because that's where the market is in North America and around the world. But that doesn't mean to say you can't get them better for our conditions. Separation modules, like I said before, I've made them for John Deere's and case, and yep, they make a lot of difference to them. And another one that I probably haven't touched on just yet is the cleaning system, which is all the sieves and the pre-cleaners and all that sort of stuff. Just make sure that they are not worn, or the louvers, or like there's wires that hold the louvers in the frame, and they just wear out over some time. They just wear out. So they need replacing. If they're worn, they need replacing. And when you replace them, you've got to fit them all in, and especially in a case in a New Holland, because they're a split system, make sure that those top and bottom sieves open evenly from side to side. So one side is exactly the same as the other side. And there's adjustment there, because if you don't, and one side could be, a couple of mils wider than the other, well, the air from the fan will just go through the easiest place, which is the wider one, and one side of the cleaning system will be struggling, the other side will be, getting probably grain blown out of it. And so it's very important to get those set evenly from side to side and front to back, and then also calibrate them from the screen to make sure that, if it says 10 millimetre on the screen, it is actually 10 millimetre on the sieves in the machine. And that's, it's all written in those operators' manuals on how to do it. Another thing for case in New Holland is to fit those top sieve rear curtains. Now, they hang off the rear finger grate off the top sieve, and they sort of hang forward. And what that does is to greatly reduce the air that can go between the top and the bottom sieve and just go out the finger grate. And because we need the air to go through the sieves to, give the cleaning system capacity and efficiency, so you can get the most out of it. If it goes out any other way, well, it's just wasting air and efficiency of the machine. So that's about for the sieves and that.
How about some basic harvest operations?
There's a few changes that have probably come through, especially with automation in machines now. Probably talking for New Holland and Case at this stage is Case call it Harvest Command and feed rate control, and New Holland call it InteleSense and InteleCruise, I think it is. They're basically the same thing. So one, Harvest Command, InteleSense, they control about 6 or 7 functions on the machine. That could be rotor speed, fan speed, pre-cleaner, top and bottom sieves, fan speed, and then the feed rate control or InteleCruise is what's actually controlling the speed of the machine. Now, those two functions are linked together, which, and once they're set up properly, it works exceptionally well. Now, I believe John Deere has got a similar setup in their X series and the later S7 series. They're basically the same sort of thing now. And as far as I know, Class has had this sort of setup for a fair while. And I would say that probably Class is probably the best one or the most advanced one at this stage. But the others are catching up, very quickly. And there's always new improvements coming through. Like you'll see from C&H, it probably, there could be 4 or 5 improvements come through a year from, they're just tweaking the software to try and get it better and better and better. But it absolutely works. But like I said, got to have all those basics set up first to give the automation a chance of getting the best capacity and efficiency out of the machine. So one thing I will say about the automation is it will probably run the rotor faster than what we would have normally thought, and that's fine because it doesn't hurt the crop, but what a faster rotor speed will give you greater separation of grain from straw, chaff and all that sort of stuff out of the rotor cage. Because the automation looks at the cracked grain as well, so if it decides to, just say for instance, go to 1,100 revs in canola or what it is, and there's a whole heap of cracked grain come through, well, it will slow that rotor down. But there's also defaults in the background of the automation to say, well, don't go any faster than this because that is likely to cause cracked grain. And it'll work it out, but there's always those crop conditions or environmental conditions that can have an effect on the crop, which can induce cracked grain. So all those sensors on the machines that will say, okay, well, there's cracked grain, we'll slow the rotor down a bit and things like that. And it will try everything it can to get the best quality grain it can and limit those losses under the parameters that you've set for it. So if you want to change the parameters a bit and say, well, I can accept a little bit more loss, but we'll have more capacity, well, that's fine. The machine will do it. Well, you've got to understand what you've set that machine up to do, and it's just a matter of tweaking those settings a little bit at a time and give the machine a little bit of time for it to learn, and it'll work it out. It does amazingly well, actually.
So with setting up for starting at the basics with your vital setups and your calibration points, if you're changing from paddock to paddock, or even if you're changing from cereals to pulses, do you need to make sure that you're rechecking your calibrations and everything for the different types that you're harvesting?
There's a default settings in the machine, but every year is a little bit different, and every variety is a little bit different. So you've just got to go and check that all the time to say, well, okay, these settings worked last year or in the paddock over there, but they're not working quite as well as here. And that may be just variety. Could be frosted, could be anything. And so you've just got to tweak those settings a little bit to compensate for those changes in that crop. And then the automation will pick it up and it'll be fine. It'll work it out.
So how about cleaning? So obviously, once you've finished your harvest and you do your big clean down and pack it away, during the harvesting period, should you be regularly checking and cleaning the bits and pieces of it, like say your feeder house, things like that, to make sure that there's no pile up there to cause fires and smouldering and things like that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good vital point, actually. Harvester hygiene is a major point, because if you haven't got a dirty machine, it's unlikely to catch fire if something goes wrong. But if you've got straw and that piled up everywhere, well, potentially you got problems. And so, depending on the crop, but I clean it every day, and then sometimes in particular crops, like especially pulse crops, because they're just one of those ones that they have a lot of fluff and that flying around everywhere, and it's volatile. So sometimes you might have to stop 3 or 4 times a day and just clean the machine down so you don't have that potential for fire. And then, at the end of harvest, well, yeah, you can clean them down, and you can still find stuff coming out of them. But you've just got to make a really, really good attempt every day, I think, is to give them a really good clean out, and it will potentially save you if something goes wrong.
Absolutely, it will. So it's, of course, most important, a couple of things here just to summarize is to make sure that you are reading your manual and completely understanding your machine from the front all the way through to the back, making sure that you're checking all your calibrations, and also making sure that you're keeping it clean during harvest, as well as obviously after when you pack away.
Yep. That harvester hygiene and maintenance, daily maintenance is, you do all those, and you'll have a much less stressed harvest, because no one wants to play spanners when it's 45 degrees outside.
Well, as always, Rod, it's a pleasure catching up and finding out more about it, and also learning about the basics and the vitals of setting up your headers. Thanks for joining us here on the Harvestaire Podcast.
Yep. Thanks, Dave. No worries. We'll catch you.
You've been listening to Dave Pettit on the Harvestaire Podcast with the special guest, contracting harvester, Rod Gribble.